"You already died? You just don't know it yet," said my son-in-law after changing my will at the notary's office. I was sitting on the porch of my house in Asheville, North Carolina, watching the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance when my daughter, Rebecca, arrived with that smile I hadn't seen for months. It was a September morning, the crisp air carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a quiet autumn. I was 72 years old, enjoying a comfortable retirement after 45 years working as a civil engineer, and owned a 12-acre property I had bought for $320,000 15 years ago. Today, it was worth over $1,200,000. The main house had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a library that Dorothy had decorated with so much care, and large windows that framed the mountains like living paintings. There was also a guest cottage I had built with my own hands in the 90s, when Rebecca and Thomas still brought friends to spend vacations with us. All of this represented not only financial value, but decades of memories, of hard work, of realized dreams. I didn't know that visit would mark the beginning of the worst chapter of my life. Rebecca was accompanied by her husband, Marcus, a 41-year-old man who always seemed excessively attentive to me, in that way that makes you suspect whether the kindness is genuine or calculated. He had those eyes that never stopped moving, always assessing, always calculating. In recent months, I had noticed subtle changes in Rebecca, too. She was more nervous, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't completely hide. They sat with me on the porch, Marcus strategically choosing the chair closest to mine. Rebecca held my hand with her usual delicacy, but her palms were damp, a sign of nervousness I had recognized since she was small. She said she was worried about me living alone on such a large, isolated property, that anything could happen and no one would know, that I could fall, have a heart attack, be days without help. Marcus added that it would be more practical for me to update my will, put things in order, facilitate everything for when I was no longer here. The way he said that, with that overly casual tone, sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the content of Marcus's words, but the tone. There was something too definitive, too urgent about it, as if he were marking a deadline on an invisible agenda. I had lost my wife, Dorothy, 3 years earlier, a pancreatic cancer they diagnosed at stage 4 and took her in just 6 brutal months. During that period, Rebecca had been my support, coming to visit every week, bringing homemade meals, sitting with me in silence when words were unnecessary. Marcus rarely came along, always had some work commitment, some important meeting. At the time, I didn't question it. I was too focused on caring for Dorothy, on enjoying every second we had left. But after Dorothy passed, Rebecca's visits started to become more spaced out. First fortnightly, then monthly, and in the last 3 months there had been only 3 quick visits, always with Marcus present, always with superficial conversations about the weather and my health. My son, Thomas, lived in Seattle, working as a senior software engineer at Microsoft, earning over $300,000 a year. He had built his own life on the West Coast, had a wife named Jennifer, and 2 daughters I only saw via video call. We talked once a month, if that, brief conversations about work projects and the girls' activities. Thomas was always more emotionally distant, a trait he inherited from me, I recognized. Rebecca was different, or at least she had been. She was affectionate, present, the daughter who called for no reason just to check on me, until Marcus entered her life. I told them that morning that my will was perfectly organized, that everything was already divided between Rebecca and Thomas, half for each, simple and fair. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine with uncomfortable intensity. He insisted that the world had changed drastically in recent years, that there were much more efficient ways to transfer wealth, avoid federal and state taxes that could consume up to 40% of the inheritance value. He spoke about estate planning, about living trusts, about how smart families protected their assets in ways that traditional families ignored. He knew an excellent lawyer in Charlotte, a wealth planning specialist with decades of experience, could save thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars for my children. Rebecca agreed with every word her husband said, her eyes shining with an animation that deeply disturbed me. It was the same expression I saw in her when she was a teenager and wanted something very specific, something she had rehearsed asking for. I should have paid more attention to that warning sign, but loneliness has a way of making us accept questionable company simply because it's better than the constant silence of an empty house. 2 weeks later, on a cloudy October morning, Marcus appeared alone at my door at 8 a.m. He said he had scheduled an appointment with the lawyer for 10 o'clock, that it would be quick, just a technical update of the document, nothing more complicated than changing the oil in the car. The analogy should have alerted me, but I was tired of living alone, tired of distrusting everyone, and perhaps a deep part of me desperately wanted to believe that my daughter and son-in-law genuinely cared about my well-being. I should have called my own lawyer, Gerald Patterson, who had handled my legal affairs for over 20 years, who had helped me buy the property, who had prepared the original will after Dorothy's death. But I didn't call. I simply put on my best shirt, grabbed my wallet and documents, and got into Marcus's black BMW. The trip to Charlotte took 2 hours and 15 minutes. Marcus drove fast, always a few miles above the speed limit, but never enough to attract the attention of police. Throughout the journey, he talked nonstop, a rehearsed monologue about investments, about how Rebecca deserved financial security after having cared for me during Dorothy's illness. He mentioned that Rebecca had sacrificed promotion opportunities in her job as a human resources manager to be available whenever I needed her. He said that now that I was stable, settled into the routine of widowhood, it was time to ensure all her sacrifice was recognized and rewarded. He talked about how I had worked my whole life, 45 years designing bridges and infrastructure systems, and now needed to ensure my legacy would be well managed, protected from predatory taxes, kept safe for the next generation. It all sounded reasonable when he put it that way. In the Charlotte office, on the 23rd floor of a mirrored building, a man in a gray suit named Richard Volkov received us with firm handshakes. His office was decorated in mahogany and leather, with diplomas from Duke University Law School and certifications covering a wall. There were photos of him with local politicians receiving awards. Everything there screamed success and credibility. Volkov had a leather folder already prepared on his mahogany desk. Documents printed on expensive letterhead with the look of something that cost $1,000 per page. He explained that the new will created an irrevocable living trust, a fiduciary fund that would protect my assets from state and federal inheritance taxes, potentially saving $200,000 to $300,000 for my heirs. He used technical terms that sounded impressive, but which I didn't fully understand. He spoke about estate tax mitigation, about beneficiary designations, about asset protection strategies, about probate avoidance. Each sentence was punctuated with references to success stories, statistics on how much money other families had saved, warnings about how much the government would take if I didn't act smartly now. Marcus was sitting next to me, nodding at every point Volkov made, occasionally asking technical questions that showed he had studied all that vocabulary beforehand. It was a rehearsed performance, I realized later, a play with two experienced actors deceiving an audience of one. Volkov turned to the last page, indicated 3 places where I should sign, explaining that Marcus would witness the first signature, a secretary would witness the second, and everything would be notarized before we left the office. I took the pen he offered me, a heavy, cold Mont Blanc in my hand. I asked if I shouldn't take the documents home, show them to my own lawyer. Volkov exchanged a quick glance with Marcus before smiling patiently and explaining that my own lawyer certainly wasn't a modern estate planning specialist, that these structures were too complex for generalist lawyers, that delays could cost thousands if new tax regulations were approved in the next legislative cycle. Marcus placed his hand on my shoulder with a grip that was simultaneously comforting and coercive. He said Rebecca trusted this process completely, that she had researched everything, that Volkov had an impeccable reputation. I signed where Volkov indicated, 3 times. Marcus witnessed with an elaborate signature he practiced to look important. The secretary, a woman in her 30s with a neutral expression like someone who had seen that scene dozens of times, witnessed too. The notary applied his seal with a stamp that made a final, definitive sound. We left that office in less than an hour. In the elevator descending, Marcus was different. His shoulders more relaxed, a half-smile playing on his lips, a contained energy of someone who just won a major bet. On the way back to Asheville, the change in him became more obvious with every mile. He stopped making that thoughtful conversation about my well-being. He started talking about plans he and Rebecca had, a trip to Cancun they were planning, maybe buying a new car, a Mercedes Rebecca always wanted. He spoke as if he were spending money that was already his. When we got close to Asheville, he didn't drive straight to my house. Instead, he detoured to a famous tourist overlook near the Blue Ridge Parkway, a place called Craggy Gardens where tourists stopped to photograph the mountains. It was late afternoon. The sun was setting, staining everything orange, red, and intense purple. The parking lot was empty except for us. Marcus turned off the engine and remained silent for a whole minute, just looking out the window, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel in an anxious rhythm. Then he turned to me. His eyes had a hardness I had never seen before, a calculated coldness that made me understand that everything I had thought about him was wrong. He wasn't simply ambitious or a little arrogant, he was dangerous. You already died, you just don't know it yet. The words came out of his mouth with a cruel pleasure, each syllable savored as if he had waited months to say that. The trust you signed is not what Volkov explained. It's a document that places all your assets in Rebecca's name with immediate and irrevocable effect. The property, the bank accounts, the stock and bond investments, everything, the total of $893,000 in liquid assets plus the property valued at $1,200,000. Everything now legally belongs to your daughter, and I, as her husband, have full and unrestricted power of attorney to manage everything on her behalf. You understand what that means, Walter. He didn't wait for me to answer. He continued speaking, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer explaining something obvious to a particularly slow child. You can continue living in your house, on the property you bought, built, and maintained for 15 years, but only as long as you behave. If you cause trouble, if you try to contest the trust, if you talk to lawyers or the police, We can have you removed for mental incompetence. Everything is already prepared. I have medical reports signed by a psychiatrist in Raleigh who has never met you but will attest that you are suffering from advanced dementia, that you are a danger to yourself, that you need immediate institutional care. I know a private asylum near Durham where they accept difficult patients without asking many questions. It would cost only $3,000 a month, which would come out of your inheritance, of course. You could live there another 5-10 years maybe, depending on your health, and when you finally die for real, anything left over would be divided as the trust specifies. 60% for Rebecca, 40% for administrative expenses, which means for me. My heart was beating so fast I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. My vision blurred at the edges. I felt a sharp pain in my chest that made me think maybe I really was dying right there, that Marcus wouldn't have to wait, that a heart attack would solve everything for him at that moment. I tried to speak, but my throat was closed. Marcus observed my reaction with clinical interest, like a scientist watching a rat in an experiment. After a few seconds that seemed like hours, he continued, "Thomas receives nothing in this trust. 0. That wasn't an accident. It was intentional. When he questions it, and he will question it because Thomas was always the skeptical son, the son who distrusted me from the beginning, we will show him the documents that prove you deliberately excluded him. We will say you were resentful because he never came to visit you, because he built his life in Seattle and abandoned you. Rebecca will testify that in recent years you constantly talked about how Thomas didn't care, about how he chose his career and his family over you. Half of those conversations actually happened, Walter. You really said those things. We just recorded and saved them for this moment." He then explained that he had engineered this scam for over 18 months. It started subtly, planting seeds of resentment in Rebecca. He had hidden the real magnitude of the debts from her. Rebecca knew about some credit cards, a car loan, but didn't know about the 3 personal loans with absurd rates, that he had used her name as a co-signer without her knowing, that he owed money to loan sharks in Charlotte. Marcus had lost his job 8 months earlier, not due to downsizing, but for stealing commissions from other salespeople. The company just fired him to avoid negative publicity. Since then, he hadn't worked a single day. He had told Rebecca he did independent consulting. In reality, he spent his days researching asset fraud schemes, looking for unscrupulous lawyers. That's how he found Volkov, a man who operated in the legal gray area in Charlotte. Volkov charged 30% of the transferred assets. In my case, over $600,000. I spent that entire night awake in the living room, sitting in the armchair Dorothy had chosen, looking at photos on the mantelpiece. Rebecca as a baby in my lap, Rebecca graduating, Rebecca at her wedding to Marcus, Dorothy and I beaming. How had it gone so wrong? I had enough money to live until 90, over $800,000 in investments besides the property. I had planned to leave everything to my children. And now I discovered I had handed everything over to a con artist and a daughter I no longer recognized. The next morning, at 7, I called Gerald Patterson. I explained everything, my voice trembling with anger and humiliation. Gerald remained silent before saying we needed to act fast. He asked me not to confront Rebecca or Marcus, not to do anything that looked like unstable behavior. They were waiting for any excuse to have me declared mentally incapacitated. Gerald scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. When I arrived at his office in Asheville, he had already investigated Richard Volkov. The man wasn't exactly a criminal, but operated in a legal gray area, specializing in helping families circumvent inheritance regulations, often at the expense of elderly family members. There were 3 lawsuits against him in the last 10 years, all settled out of court with confidentiality agreements. Gerald explained that the trust I had signed was technically legal, but had been obtained through fraud and coercion. The problem was proving it in court, a process that could take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Meanwhile, Marcus and Rebecca would have total control of my assets. But Gerald had a different idea. He knew Judge Harold Matthews, a 78-year-old man who had seen similar cases before and had a reputation for not tolerating elder abuse. 2 days later, I was in Judge Matthews' chambers, an office with walls lined with law books and the smell of old coffee. Gerald had prepared an emergency petition alleging fraud, undue influence, and elder abuse. We presented the recordings of the conversations with Marcus. Yes, I had recorded everything on my cell phone since that day at the Overlook, something Gerald taught me to do immediately. We also presented an analysis of the documents showing how the trust had been structured to exclusively benefit Marcus through Rebecca, leaving Thomas completely out, which proved it was not my real intention. Judge Matthews read everything carefully, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he turned the pages. He asked direct questions about my mental health, about my ability to manage my finances, about my relationship with Rebecca before Marcus entered the scene. At the end of 2 hours, he signed a temporary order freezing all my assets and suspending the trust until a full hearing that would be scheduled for 3 weeks later. When Marcus found out, he exploded. He showed up at my property yelling that I had broken our agreement, that I was an ungrateful old man, that Rebecca was devastated by my lack of trust in her. I let him yell from the other side of the electronic gate. I didn't open it. I didn't answer. I just filmed him with my cell phone as he threatened to sue for defamation, for breach of contract, for parental alienation. Every word that came out of his mouth was more evidence for my case. He finally left when he realized I wasn't going to react, that I wasn't going to fall into the trap of appearing uncontrolled or confused. Rebecca called the next day. Her voice was different, harder, more desperate. She said I didn't understand, that they really needed that help, that Marcus had lost his job 8 months ago and was hiding it from her too, that the debts were much worse than she imagined, that they would lose everything if I didn't help. I asked why she hadn't come to talk to me honestly, why she had chosen to deceive me instead of asking for help. She didn't know how to answer. She remained silent for so long that I thought she had hung up. Then she started to cry, that convulsive crying she had as a child. She said Marcus had convinced her it was the only way, that I would never agree to help them because I was always critical about how they spent money, that she was afraid of disappointing me, afraid of admitting she had failed. I said that stealing wasn't disappointing, it was betraying, that there was a huge difference between asking for help and committing fraud, that if she needed money, I would have helped, but now it was too late. Everything had to be settled in court because I could no longer trust her. I hung up and realized I was crying too. That wasn't the daughter I had raised. Or maybe it was, and I had never wanted to see it. The 3 weeks until the hearing were the longest of my life. Gerald worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing other Volkov victims, building a solid case. He discovered that Marcus had a history of minor frauds, a pattern that showed who he really was. He had cheated 2 employers with falsified reports, 3 collection lawsuits for unpaid debts, His whole life was a lie and schemes for easy money, and I had given my blessing to that marriage 7 years ago. The hearing took place in the first week of October in a smaller courtroom in the Buncombe County Courthouse. Judge Matthews presided personally, an indication that he took the case seriously. Marcus and Rebecca were there with a lawyer who seemed very expensive for people who claimed to be broke, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by the judge. Gerald presented our case methodically. The recordings where Marcus admitted the fraud, the documents showing how the trust had been structured, witnesses who confirmed my complete mental capacity, an accountant who demonstrated how the scheme had been planned to divert funds. Marcus's lawyer tried to argue that everything had been a misunderstanding, that I had voluntarily agreed to the changes in the will, that the recordings had been taken out of context. But when Judge Matthews asked Marcus to explain his statement that I was dead, I just didn't know it yet. He couldn't. He stammered, looked at the lawyer for help, finally admitted he had expressed himself badly, that he was frustrated, that he didn't mean it literally. Judge Matthews removed his glasses and looked directly at Marcus for long seconds before speaking. He said that in 40 years as a judge, he had seen many cases of financial abuse of the elderly, but few as calculated and predatory as this one. He said Marcus had taken advantage of the loneliness and vulnerability of a man who had just lost his wife to execute a scam that, if not for my courage to report it, would have left me completely dependent on their goodwill. He invalidated the trust completely, restored my original will, and ordered Marcus and Rebecca to pay all legal costs, a total of $42,000. He also issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting Marcus from approaching me or my property for at least a year. When Marcus tried to protest, the judge interrupted him and strongly suggested he stay quiet if he didn't want to face criminal charges of fraud and elder abuse. Rebecca left that courtroom looking 10 years older. She tried to approach me in the hallway, but Gerald stepped between us and said any future communication should go through him. I saw my daughter collapse in tears in Marcus's arms, and for the first time I felt more anger than compassion. She had made her choices. She had chosen the con artist husband instead of the father who was always there for her. In the following days, I learned through mutual acquaintances that Marcus and Rebecca had separated. She had discovered that the debts were even worse than he had admitted, over $300,000, including loans from loan sharks I didn't even know still existed in the modern United States. Marcus had lost his job not due to downsizing as he had told her, but for stealing commissions from other salespeople. Everything about him was a lie upon a lie. Rebecca filed for divorce 2 weeks after the hearing. She called me, not to apologize exactly, but to tell me she was trying to fix her life, that she had started therapy, that she eventually wanted to rebuild our relationship if I allowed it. I said I needed time, a lot of time. Trust isn't rebuilt in weeks or months, maybe years, maybe never completely. But I said I was willing to consider it eventually, because in the end she was my daughter, and I had raised her to know the difference between right and wrong. She had lost her way, but maybe she could find herself again. Marcus, on the other hand, disappeared. He moved somewhere in Texas. I learned later from Gerald. Volkov lost his license to practice law in North Carolina after 3 other cases similar to mine came to light following my victory in court. Apparently, I wasn't the only elderly person he had helped scam, just the first brave enough to sue publicly. 6 months later, I was back on my porch watching the mountains. It was March, spring arriving. Thomas had come to visit me from Seattle. We spent a week talking about how sometimes the people we love disappoint us in unimaginable ways. He always found Marcus suspicious, but never imagined anything like this. We talked about Rebecca, about second chances. Thomas said it depended on what she did, not what she said. Words were easy. Real change was hard. Rebecca had started sending me weekly messages, telling me about her therapy, how she was paying off the debts left by Marcus, how she had gone back to school. I replied briefly, but kept my distance. Maybe one day. My will remained equally divided between Rebecca and Thomas, not because of what she did, but despite it, because I decided I wasn't going to let Marcus's actions destroy my family, because forgiving didn't mean forgetting, but it meant choosing not to let hatred poison my years. I was 73, in reasonable health, with sufficient resources and a clarity that only comes after almost losing everything. I learned that family isn't just blood. It's choice, trust, presence. I learned that loneliness isn't living alone on 12 acres. Loneliness is being surrounded by people you can't trust. I learned that the greatest revenge isn't destroying those who betrayed you, but continuing to live well, rebuilding, moving forward. Not letting them steal more than they already tried to. As I watched the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold, I thought about all the structures I designed as an engineer. Bridges, buildings, systems that needed to withstand weight and time. Life was like that. You built structures of trust, of love, of family. Sometimes they collapsed, but you could rebuild. Different, smaller, more cautious, but still solid. Still standing. Still yours. I picked up my phone and opened Rebecca's last message. A photo of her at her master's graduation. Her first step back. I typed a simple reply. Congratulations. I'm proud of you. Small steps. Structures are built with small steps at a time. Foundation first. Trust later. Perhaps, eventually, family again. But with eyes wide open. With documents well reviewed. And with the certainty that I would never sign anything again without my own lawyer present.